It's funny because like there's certain books I had from when I was younger that I just loved, and I never saw the exhibit. And I was so excited when I heard that there was going to be a talk on this. And I said to my husband, I know exactly where the book is. He said, all these years later? I said, yep, all these years later. And I pulled it out. So 40 years I've had this thing.
That's fantastic. It's one of my favorite things about researching this project is hearing people who were engaged with it when it first showed. Because when I did the research at Harvard, one of the librarians said that she saw it when it came to Boston in around 1980. And she remembered waiting in line for hours to get to go through it and just how transformative an experience it was. And then to have this piece, it sat in storage for decades before it came to the Sackler Center. So it's a really interesting, I'm not going to get into too much of that in this talk, unfortunately, but it's always been amazing to me.
I wanted to embroider on it, and I remember my parents saying, wait, what is it about? And and they're like, no. And I'm like, well, yeah, I want to do this. It's so exciting. Like,
yep. And that is something I'm going to talk about, is the feeling that volunteers actually had towards the project and what they were actually doing. So hopefully I can kind of speak to how you felt about it at the time.
I think that's a great transition. I want us to go ahead and get started on time. I know we'll have plenty of people joining us as we go, but just to get the nitty-gritty Zoom stuff out of the way. But I want to start first by welcoming everyone. We're so excited to have you today for Food, Feminism, and Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Abby King. I'm the Assistant Director of Adult Programs here at PAFA, and I facilitate some of these weekly Zoom chats we've been having now for the last few months. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to just do a quick kind of talk about some Zoom things, just so for any of you who are new to the call or new to our programs that you know how we'll run it today. So I'm going to start just by muting everybody. Emily, of course, feel free to unmute yourself. And I want to, of course, I start every program with a huge thank you to our membership. So thank you all of the PAFA members on the call. I recognize many of you, seeing your faces here, your names listed. Thank you for helping us keep us PAFA strong and for coming back. And for those of you who aren't members, please consider joining today if you haven't already. But again, a big welcome to everyone who's here on the call for another Art at Noon. I want to just quickly talk about, I know for many of us, this is feels like our millionth Zoom call. But for how we facilitate these, I'm gonna, like you can already tell, I've gone ahead and muted everyone. So we're going to ask that you stay muted until the end of the program, and we are going to make sure there's time for a Q&A. But for that, throughout the call, we do want to hear from you, so feel free to put things in the chat. I'm going to get that started. We've already had somebody who shared an amazing resource with us, not via links, but with a book that she brought today. So if you have other Judy Chicago links, thoughts, questions, feel free to drop them in the chat here as well. And I'm going to quickly drop a link about our membership since I mentioned it. So utilize that. When we open it up for questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can also virtually raise your hand. So if you're on a laptop, at the bottom of your screen, there'll be a button that says participants. When you click on that, there should be the option on the right-hand side to virtually raise hand. You can also wave us down this way and we will call on you, but try that way because there are already 86 of us on the call. So just to help us manage things a little bit today. A few other things. So next to that mute button at the bottom of your screen, there's a little camera button. I mention that because we are recording today's event. All of our videos get uploaded to PAFA's YouTube channel a day or two after the event. So if you have anybody who wanted to be here today and couldn't come, I'll drop that link in just a second as well. But if you don't want to be on camera, you can feel free to mute your camera that way as well. I'll also mention if you're not actively asking a question or speaking, probably won't be on the recording, but just in case so you know. That's how that works. Other quick things. So Zoom views, if I'm the big talking head at the bottom of your screen, you're in speaker view, and that's what I will recommend that you stay, at least for the first half of the event in that, so you can see Emily nice and big. Emily, I'm gonna have you wave really quick so people can pin you. So you wanna say something too?
Hi everybody, thank you for coming.
Our speaker today. So once you see Emily's square, if you want to click on the 3 dots next to her name, there's a drop-down menu where you can pin her. And so that way, no matter what, if you're in speaker view, you'll be able to see her, but just in case, that way she'll stay on your screen the whole time. She is going to be sharing a PowerPoint. So I'd also, another reason why to stay in speaker mode for that, this option as well. Other than that, I'm sure there's plenty of things to go over. Other questions, if you have them, you can drop them in the chat in Zoom or message me directly. Again, Abby King. But now I'd really love to just introduce our speaker today. So Emily Elizabeth Goodman is an art historian, curator, and critic, and assistant professor of art history at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, where she's also the co-director of the Digital Liberal Arts Initiative. Emily received her BA from McGill University and her MA and PhD from the University of California, San Diego. Her research focuses on the use of food culture in American feminist art during the era of the Second Wave. And she's currently working on a book-length manuscript on this topic for Routledge. Her most recent critical and curatorial work has focused on contemporary women artists' examinations of craft and domestic labor in the American South. Her writing can be found in hyperallergic.com, underman.com, Number Magazine, and in journals including Performance Research and in her forthcoming article for Hybrid Pedagogy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Elizabeth Goodman. We're so happy you could be with us today on this call.
Thank you. And thank you, Abby. All right, I'm gonna start with my screen share. Hold on one second. All right. Share. And get this into the right view here. All right, can everyone see my slideshow here? Yes, all right, good. Okay, so thank you very much, Abby and Susanna, for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to engage with a different community on a work that I actually haven't thought about in a while, so I'm kind of grateful for it. As Abby said, I am an art history professor in Lexington, Kentucky, and I received my PhD from the University of California, San Diego. And it was in San Diego that I started actually studying food and feminist art in Southern California, specifically Southern California feminist art and feminist art institutions there. As well as in my dissertation, I compared them to places in New York. And in my current book project, I'm actually just focusing on Southern California for a number of reasons. And so this project actually comes from my dissertation. It's not actually in the forthcoming book, but it still touches on many of the themes that I have in the book. And also with that, I'm going to actually present some of the works that are in the book that I'm currently working on. So I'll hopefully have a little chance to talk about the broader trend of food within feminist art history during this period and in this location. So this talk does come from my dissertation research. It comes specifically from research I did as a dissertation fellow at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. It was interesting for me to go back and kind of look through the immense amount of research that I did just on this project that has a ton of documentation, and it's a really, really well-known project. So I'm actually kind of grateful because many people have encountered the dinner party in many different ways, but this was a really unique way to look at it in a way that I hadn't thought about it, even though I had done a considerable amount of research on it for my dissertation. I'm just going to start with a brief overview of what I plan to show, or what I plan to talk about, and then I will kind of get into the talk. So I'm going to give a little background to this research and a little context that I think is really important for the lens that I use in my own research. And then we're going to talk about Judy Chicago as a figure in the history of the dinner party itself. Excuse me. And then we're going to talk about the test plate for Marcella, which is the plate that is in PAFA's collection. And then talk a little bit more about food and other feminist artworks, kind of the stuff that I'm working on in the current projects. And then hopefully wrap up with a little conclusion and question and answer. So that's kind of the overview. So before I begin my discussion, and the screen is intentionally left blank, don't worry, you didn't cut out on you. Before I begin my discussion on the test plate from the dinner party, I do want to take a minute to discuss the role of race in my research. I am currently examining white feminist artists, or projects by white feminist artists through a critical race theory lens. The purpose of doing so is to critically engage with whiteness as a racial construction, and to unsettle the perception that white culture is just culture. Whiteness is not normative, nor is it neutral, and to consider it as such is to uphold white supremacy. So in using this lens, we can thus more apparently see some of the limits of white feminist activity during the 1970s. White women involved in second wave feminism or women's liberation were often guilty of appropriating the struggles of people of color into the language of their own liberation. This is largely because many of the women active in these circles, particularly within radical feminist circles, began their activism in the civil rights movement and organizations like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. In these movements, these women began to see how inequalities are structural and not personal. So things that so systems of inequality don't exist. They feel personal, but they actually exist on a structural level. So they're able to see that these are structural and not personal. And they also experience marginalization within these movements, since white women were often relegated to secretarial labor and were often subject to the sexual advances of men within the movements. As such, these women took their raised consciousness about the idea and the existence of structural oppression regarding one form of inequality and began to investigate the conditions in which they themselves were marginalized. And in so doing, they would often equate the iniquities like the labor of, or the unwaged labor of housewifery with slavery. While in both cases, housewifery and slavery, significant amounts of work are conducted with no compensation, it is important to note that slavery is a form of genocide and marriage decidedly is not.
Hey, Emily? Can I just pause you for 1 second? There have been a couple requests for you to slow down a little bit, which I don't think you saw. So I'm going to put that out there because every word you're saying is amazing.
Thank you. Okay. I will do my best. I am notorious for speaking really fast and I apologize. All right. Moreover, white feminists were often myopic in their understanding of what liberation would look like for all women, and they often neglected to consider the labors and struggles of women of color in their own fight for equality. In The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, a series of remarks she made at the Second Sex Conference in 1979, Black feminist scholar Audre Lorde notes, quote, "Poor women and women of color know that there is a difference between the daily manifestations of marital slavery and prostitution, because it is our daughters who line 42nd Street. If white American feminist theory need not deal with the differences between us and the resulting differences in our oppressions, then how do you deal with the fact that the women who clean your houses and tend your children while you attend conferences on feminist theory are, for the most part, poor women and women of color," end quote. This is not to say that all second wave feminists were disinterested in the struggles of women of color. Many desired solidarity and sisterhood regardless of race, but in so doing, they pretended that all racial categories are equal, which is a fact we know today to be false. In this particular moment, right now in 2020, when we are considering the history and impact of racism and white supremacy, it is important to note that whiteness exists within a racial hierarchy, and that even where oppression and inequality exist within white communities based on things like gender, class, sexual orientation, ability, etc., those struggles do not carry with them the additional burden and violence of systemic racism. So thinking about that, this talk therefore focuses on the liberation struggle of white women during the 1970s, agitating against the laws and cultures that limited their ability to be fully integrated into society as individuals. In particular, I will examine how artworks can and have functioned as forms of activism and avenues of advocacy within the climate of this fight for liberation, and how white feminists use their art practices for consciousness-raising efforts, highlighting the sustained and systematic gender inequities that exist within the practice of daily life. So with that noted, for this talk, I was asked to build this talk around an object in PAFA's collection, and I chose this test plate from Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, because this test plate is in many ways a unique object. It's a preparatory sketch and a part of the work that went into Judy Chicago's landmark work, The Dinner Party, but it also provides us a unique access point into this monumental piece. So I will do much more analysis of this plate and of The Dinner Party, but I feel it's important to let everybody know a little bit about Judy Chicago and how this piece came into being. Born Judy Cohen in 1939, Judy Chicago changed her name to Chicago in 1970, rebranding herself after her hometown. And I've also heard tell that it was because of her very thick Chicago accent, specifically in an effort to eschew both the patrilineal name of Cohen and her marital name of Garowitz. Chicago had been using the name Judy Garowitz, the name she took after her first marriage to Jerry Garowitz in 1960, even after he had died in 1963 in a car crash, and she had subsequently remarried in 1965 to Lloyd Hamrill. So Chicago rebranded herself and kind of restarted her art career in 1970 as this independent, non-patrilineal, non-maritally named person. With her own feminist consciousness being engaged in the practice of her own making, she also started to turn to feminist pedagogy and established some of the most well-known feminist art programs in the country. In 1970, she established the first feminist art program at Fresno State University with the stated desire to create a space for women to make art away from men and to use consciousness raising and feminist theory as a basis for their practice. She says, quote, "Consciousness raising is an essential part of the women's movement and of a feminist art program. It provides a method by which women can examine their experiences and see how social conditioning has affected their personality structures. This is very important because many young women raised to please men and quote unquote be nice find it difficult to assert themselves as artists. One of the first steps in a feminist art program is to help women feel comfortable about being aggressive, ambitious, and directed. Consciousness raising is a great help in this process. In 1971, Chicago, along with several of her students from Fresno State, moved the feminist art program to the California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, where Chicago teamed up with Miriam Shapiro as the co-director of the program. And you can see Chicago and Shapiro on the left, actually in Faith Wilding's crochet environment from their project Woman House. The inaugural class of the CalArts Feminist Art Program is responsible for the monumental work Woman House, a section of which I will discuss a little bit later. In 1973, Judy Chicago helped to establish the Los Angeles Women's Building with Arlene Ravin and Sheila LeBrant of Bredfield. The Los Angeles Women's Building was both a community center with a feminist bookshop and classes on everything from tax prep and self-defense, and as well as an active art space. Most notably, it was home to the Feminist Studio Workshop, an accredited independent art program for women built around feminist engagement with the arts. Students took courses in a number of media, performance, video, printmaking, writing, etc., but they also engaged in consciousness-raising based art education. They were also entreated to see their works of art as a form of political action and use their practices to raise the public's consciousness and advocate for gender equality. I will discuss one such work later on in my discussion of the Feminist Art Workers piece, Heaven or Hell. In 1974, Judy Chicago left the Los Angeles Women's Building in order to work on her most significant artwork, The Dinner Party. Having considered Chicago's background and role in establishing feminist art programs, we should now turn to the question, what is the dinner party and what is this a test plate for? The test plate is a preparatory sketch for one of the place settings at the dinner party, a sample that allowed Chicago to test out different designs before creating the final product. The one in PAFA's collection is for the place setting Marcella, and I will discuss in great detail what I mean by all of that. But to give us a better sense of the entire work, the dinner party is a monumental installation consisting of 3 different spaces. You begin by walking past a series of entry banners that read, "And she gathered all before her, and she made for them a sign to see. And lo, they saw a vision from this day forth, like to like in all things. And then all that had divided them merged, and then everywhere was eaten once again." The next room consists of 3 triangular tables with 13 place settings each, sitting on a porcelain floor known as the heritage floor that follow key figures in women's history from the prehistoric to the present day. Finally, the last room involves the 7 heritage panels, which the Brooklyn Museum describes as, quote, large-scale hand-colored photo and text collages that portray the lives of mythical and historical women whose names are inscribed on the heritage floor of the dinner party, end quote. In its entirety, the dinner party.
Emily?
Yes.
We have continued to get a couple of requests for you to slow down a little bit. You have much knowledge to share. And I'm also going to share with everyone else, this is the last interruption I'm going to make. We're all going to do our best, and thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your knowledge.
All right. Yes, sorry, I will try. I am notorious for speaking very fast, and it gets worse a little bit when I'm reading. I apologize. In its entirety, the dinner party is a monument to women's history. The dinner party, however, is not the first work about women's history by Judy Chicago. She had been interested in the subject for several years in the early 1970s. And in the early 1970s, Chicago began developing works around key figures in women's history, such as pieces like The Great Ladies and Through the Flower. It is also important to note that in the early 1970s, women's history was a burgeoning field. The first women's studies programs were established at San Diego State and Cornell University in 1970. And a lot of that early work in in the writing of feminist history focused on, quote unquote, unearthing great women in history that are comparable to their men counterparts and illustrating the significant contributions that women have made in a number of fields, politics, art, music, science, that were written out by historians in previous generations. For instance, in 1971, Linda Nachman wrote her landmark essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?, wherein she explicates the reasons for women's exclusion from the canon of art history before using Rosa Bonheur as an example of a comparable woman master. Chicago's works, like The Great Ladies, Through the Flower, and most notably The Dinner Party, were all designed to shed light on the heretofore hidden histories of women in the mostly Western world. Judy Chicago initially conceptualized The Dinner Party to be a feminist Last Supper. She stated in her journals about the project, quote, "So then I began to think about my plates and how I was going to put them on the wall, because that's what paintings were. They were put on a wall. So then I started to think about setting them on a table, and that made me think about the Last Supper." She decided that she wanted to include more women than the 13 guests at the Last Supper, and initially landed on 25 women. But as her research continued, she found that number was too small and the guest list was too restrictive. She decided to enlarge the number to 39, creating 3 tables with 13 settings apiece, a significant number as it is both the number of men at the Last Supper and the number of members of members of a witch's coven. She arranged the tables in an equilateral triangle, meant to represent the hope for equality for women in the future, and decided to perch the tables on a porcelain tile floor, which she decorated with the names of 999 women or female figures who contributed significantly to Western history. As the project grew in scale, Chicago realized that she would not be able to complete the project alone. She initially took on a few assistants into her Santa Monica, California studio who helped with the research and the fabrication, but eventually the small group realized that they would need exponentially more help. The dinner party project grew from a single artist's work to that of almost 400 assistants working in the studio for several years. Chicago sent out calls for volunteers and recruited a variety of assistants from across the country to come to Los Angeles and to take on key tasks such as ceramic work, research, embroidery, and graphic design. The fact that Chicago receives credit for the work, even though 400 others contributed to the project, has been a sticking point for many. I would like to note that such a criticism is invalid for several reasons. First, that critique neglects to consider the long and continued history of apprenticeship in art history, wherein assistants and students have always done some fabrication. We can clearly identify which of Jacques-Louis David's students painted certain figures in his masterworks, and yet we don't attempt to attribute authorship to them. Moreover, Chicago, as we can clearly see here, was directly engaged in all parts of design and fabrication. So we see her here painting on the heritage floor and doing work with the embroidery team. And here she actually is in the embroidery loft, directing. You can see her off in the upper right corner. So Chicago is clearly directly engaged in all parts of design and fabrication, unlike some contemporary artists like Jeff Koons, for instance, who famously no longer touches his own work. Second, it is important to note that this critique invalidates the contributions of volunteers who knew what was being asked of them and came volitionally to participate in this project, and often felt that they were contributing to something meaningful in the fight for gender equality. And all of the names of the volunteers are listed in the final installation, and their labors are commemorated in Joanna Demetrakis' film about the making of the dinner party, which is often screened alongside the work. Even with all of the volunteers' help, the research process alone took several years. Chicago and a team of art historians and volunteers unearthed the names of over 3,000 women from history. Chicago solicited help in the form of reading lists and course syllabi from various scholars across the country, and compiled an extensive library of texts on women's history. Together with her assistants, she pared down the list to 1,500, then 1,200, and finally, after several sessions of advocating for the inclusion of this woman or another, they came up with a final list of 39 women for the table itself and the 999 names to adorn the floor. The research team was not the only group who was responsible for learning the history of women. Chicago established avenues within the Dinner Party Project as an organization to help facilitate feminist education amongst her volunteers. On Thursday nights, the volunteers met as a collective to discuss the project and hear from speakers over dinner. They would often engage in group quote-unquote rap sessions during these meals and consider particular issues with regard to art and politics. She also encouraged the various volunteers to form consciousness-raising groups of their own and furnish them with reading lists of feminist texts. In so doing, Chicago transformed her studio from an art practice space to that of feminist practice. Now that I have given you an overview of the making of the dinner party, let's return to the test plate. One of the reasons that this object is appealing to me to discuss is that it offers a very different access point for this particular work. Given the monumental scale of the dinner party, it's often difficult to analyze because there is too much information to apprehend all at once. On the one hand, it's physically impossible when you're actually in the space to consider the work in its totality because it is spread out over so many different rooms. And even within the individual different rooms, it is still difficult to get a handle on the whole. on the work on the whole. People may be familiar with this from the Netflix series Master of None. And in the second season of the Netflix show Master of None, the protagonist goes on a date to see the dinner party. And even in film, it's hard to get a sense of the whole work. So you have them walking around this space, and it is difficult to fully apprehend the scale and the individual components of the piece. It's also worth noting that they go through the piece backwards. Since Chicago intended for the work to be viewed chronologically, beginning with Primordial Goddess and ending with Georgia O'Keeffe, and they actually start with Georgia O'Keeffe and go backwards in history. So there you go. Since analyzing the work on the whole is difficult, many choose to focus on place settings specifically. This is likely because these are the most consistent and legible forms in the dinner party. Each setting consists of a uniform set of silverware and a chalice, and each setting has a specific placemat, which Chicago referred to as a runner, that is embroidered with something specific to each woman's identity, and the plate that was initially decorated by china painting and eventually would involve the use of sculpted ceramics. The plates in particular mostly involved a vulvar form, which is emblematic of what Chicago refers to as her quote unquote core imagery, which had been developing for years. Notably in the Great Ladies, Chicago represents each woman in the form of a geometric pattern in pastel colors that seems to undulate around a central circle or orifice meant to allude to female genitals. It is important to note that the use of this core imagery is a reflection of a larger tendency towards gynocentrism amongst feminists during the 1960s and 1970s. Within second wave feminist circles, there was an effort to reclaim and embrace the female body as a site of women's liberation. And we see this in the rise of what Amelia Jones refers to as cunt art in women's art during the 1970s and beyond. From our contemporary post-Judith Butlerian lens, we can recognize this form of gynocentrism as limited and exclusionary at best, and an outright denial of the existence of transgender women at the worst. In 2020, we are well aware that not all women have vaginas, and the possession of a vagina does not make one a woman. This understanding was not common amongst feminist circles during the second wave. While trans individuals have always existed, and we know from their prominent roles in the Stonewall uprisings in 1969, that trans women were in particular members of some activist circles, second wave feminists did not readily engage with the notion that womanhood as a gender is an experience that is separate from biological sex. Of the 39 women depicted on the table, only 3 do not have quote unquote core imagery as the basis of their plates: Ethel Smith, Sacagawea, and Sojourner Truth. That Sacagawea and Sojourner Truth's plates lack this kind of imagery is also problematic. They are the only 2 real-life women of color, as opposed to goddesses, that appear on the table. This choice to present them not through a form of core imagery thus reflects a larger tendency to quote-unquote unsex women of color within white society and to deny the bodily realities of Black and Indigenous women specifically. Moreover, that no Black or Indigenous women are present except for on the final table, which represents quote-unquote modern history, suggests that Black and Indigenous women have no history before colonization, and that their notable contributions to history have only come due to their relationship to white Americans and white American history. But back to the test plate. One of the reasons that this test plate is so interesting as an object is that it gives us an avenue to examine a very small part of this very large work. Notably, not much is written specifically about this plate. All of the mentions of Marcella that I could find in my previous archival research focused on the runner. So this is a unique chance to consider the formal elements of this specific setting on its own. Just to give a little background on Marcella and her setting on the whole, according to her biography on the Heritage Panels, Marcella founded the first convent and provided a haven for women in Rome. Given her role in early Christianity, Chicago has chosen to depict a Basilica Plan on her runner. Depending on where your Zoom call is, you may not be able to see it, but you can see here, hopefully you can see my mouse, yes? Okay, you can see here that this is a Basilica Plan. So we have the apse, we have the transept, and we have the nave. And this is a pattern that would be familiar to anyone who has taken an introductory survey of art history. In addition to the Basilica Plan, the runner also consists of this rough wool patch here that is meant to represent the hair shirts often worn by women in these early monastic communities. All of the women on the heritage floor near Marcella's settings are those associated with early Christianity and monasticism. With regard With regard to the formal elements of the place, we can very clearly see the use of the core imagery, but we can also see a clear interest in engaging with the colors used in early Christian imagery. For instance, some of the colors resemble those used in the frescoes of the Room of the Veiled Woman from the Catacomb of Priscilla. We know that this was on Chicago's mind as this catacomb appears, or as this image appears in the heritage panel for Marcella. And this image is one of the earliest and best known depiction of Christian women. In the fresco, we see images depicting important events in the life of the woman who is likely interred in this catacomb. On the left is her marriage, presided over by a priest. On the right, she is nursing an infant, likely while still sitting in a birthing chair. And in the center, she is portrayed in the errant gesture, looking up in praise at Christ, the Good Shepherd, who hovers above her, suggesting that her faith is central to the most important experiences of her life. Similarly, the plate borrows a lot from the early Christian mosaics that adorn the mausoleum of Galla Placidia, who is the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Theodosius, who was married to King Outliff of the Visigoths, and most importantly was the regent for her son Valentinian III as the Byzantine emperor, and Galla Placidia's name appears on the heritage floor next to Marcella. In particular, the use of blue and gold calls to mind the mosaics involved in this early Christian site, and we can see that in the test plate, Chicago was actually considering using more gold, which would definitely allude to the Byzantine tradition. Not only does the test plate help us gain a better narrative, or a better understanding of the narrative Chicago was attempting to portray in her setting for Marcella, the test plate also allows us to see the labor and the craft that went into the dinner party, and craft is central to Chicago's aesthetic for the work. Ceramics, china painting, and embroidery, which are the media used throughout the piece, are all feminized forms of craft that Chicago was seeking to revalue through creating this installation. In our modern conception of art, craft objects are generally considered daily use objects, while art is fully aesthetic and singularly aesthetic. In crafting the dinner party, Chicago has made something that's function is purely aesthetic, even if it derives from something useful. Not only does the dinner party call attention to craft labor, but the work also highlights the gendered work that goes into the act of domestic food service. In the dinner party, Chicago creates an elaborate dinner service meant to evoke the idea of a lavish home. The settings themselves are carefully and meticulously arranged, much in the same way that the dining room of an upper-class family would be, with each setting perfectly placed and measured to be exact. The linens of the table were carefully and neatly pressed by workers on the project, much as they would be in any fine home. As Susan Hill, who coordinated many aspects of the project, commented during the initial installation, quote, "I think of all the times my mother ironed the tablecloth for company. It just seems like the most perfect revenge to have to iron this big one," end quote. Hill's comment points out that in most American homes, the labor of preparing this kind of setting is unquestionably feminized. Moreover, Hill's apparent criticism of her mother's work highlights the ways in which this kind of labor is considered valueless and menial. In literally pulling all of the work of food service on the table and changing the context of such a presentation into an art space, Chicago is valorizing all of that invisible labor and demonstrating the considerable effort that is often taken for granted. Moreover, she is bringing a positive intellectual evaluation to the work that is often considered menial and unimportant by placing it in the context of an art museum. The dinner party was not the first, nor was it the only feminist artwork to critique the feminization of food-based labor during the 1970s. For our final few minutes, I'm going to bring up a few other examples of women artists in Southern California who used their art to call attention to women's labors surrounding food, and in so doing, challenged gendered assumptions. One artist in particular whose career has involved a careful examination of the gender politics of domestic labor, and specifically food practices, is Martha Rustler. In Semiotics of the Kitchen from 1975, Rustler employs the familiar format of television cooking programs in order to critically engage with the rhetorical construction of home cooking as a form of female labor. The roughly 6-minute-long video features Rustler in a rather small home kitchen, standing behind a table with a variety of kitchen tools and cooking appliances laid out as if she were going to use them to demonstrate specific cooking techniques. In this performance, she begins with putting on an apron, similar to what you would see in Julia Child, for example. In this particular performance, she begins by putting on an apron, naming the article as she does so, and then proceeds to identify a different appliance or dish for each letter of the alphabet, demonstrating a potential use after reciting the name. In most cases, Rustler's expository gestures are impractical in nature, involving violent gesticulations that are both loud and absurdist. She continues through the alphabet until the letter U, at which point she picks up a large meat fork and chef's knife and proceeds to make the remaining letters with her arms in the air, excepting the letter Z, which she cuts in the air with her knife in the style of Zorro. As the title of the piece suggests, Martha Rustler was particularly interested in the cultural signification affiliated with various aspects of the kitchen and cooking, specifically with regard to femininity and women's labor. In her set, she uses the space of a domestic kitchen in order to both engage with the discourse of cooking instruction through allusion to programs like Julia Child's The French Chef, but also to examine the rhetorical construction of the kitchen as a woman's domain. In case the domestic setting didn't implicitly call to mind the image of housewives cooking for their families, Rustler includes a little placard on a bookshelf that reads "Mother" in all caps in order to explicitly indicate that the space is deeply encoded with the ideological understandings of femininity. While Rustler uses these codes of signification in order to evoke the image of the housewife as home cook, her performance in the work very clearly seeks to undermine the conventional understanding of cooking and its relationship to the construct of womanhood. Through her gesticulations, Rustler destabilizes the common understanding of each of these items, demonstrating not their use, but potential alternatives thereof. Moreover, the awkwardness of her gestures and the rigidity of her body as she performs these actions unsettles the naturalism with which women are expected, by virtue of their femininity, to approach cooking as a task. In so doing, Rustler illustrates that these assumptions about women's intrinsic culinary ability and innate comfort in the kitchen are premised on a fallacy and are the result of cultural constructions of gendered labor. The question of naturalness with which women perform certain forms of food labor is also central to the Nurturant Kitchen, which is a component of the Feminist Art Program collaborative work, Woman House. For this project, Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago wanted the students in the inaugural Cal Arts Feminist Art Program to make a collaborative project. They found a house on Mariposa Street in Hollywood and began to rehabilitate the structure and develop their own large-scale installation. The project was designed so that, quote, each of the women working singly or together had made rooms or environments, bedrooms, closets, bathrooms, hallways, gardens. The age-old female activity of homemaking was taken to fantasy proportions. Woman House became the repository of the daydreams women have as they wash, bake, cook, sew, clean, and iron their lives away, end quote. Over the course of several months, the women engaged in consciousness-raising sessions, group planning meetings, and worked collectively in delineating the various projects that would occupy the rooms of Woman House, 21 different installations in total. 3 women, Susan Fraser, Vicki Hodgetts, and Robin Welch, took it upon themselves to design and develop a project that would occupy the space of the kitchen, based on discussions held with other members of the program. Of the many avenues through which womanhood is expressed within the symbolic space of the kitchen, Welch, Fraser, and Hodgetts ultimately decided on creating a unified installation that focused on women's roles as nurturers and the relationship between feeding and femininity. They painted all of the surfaces of the room, not simply the walls, but the cabinets, appliances, and cookware, a uniform shade of pale pink, dressed the windows with a set of frilly pink lace curtains, and hung a series of aprons that contained exaggerated appliques depicting various parts of the female body on the wall. They filled the drawers and the cabinetry with images of women, ranging from photos of Angela Davis to pinups from Playboy, which confronted the viewer when they attempted to use the space functionally. Finally, on the walls, they affixed a number of synthetic pink breasts, which are transformed into egg-like strip forms as the viewer raises their gaze to the ceiling. The entire space was designed to overload the audience with symbolic representations of both femininity and femaleness, from the overwhelming ubiquity of pink within the space to the hybridized eggs and breasts that covered the walls and the ceiling. The inclusion of eggs and breasts on the walls and ceiling of the Nurturant Kitchen was meant to highlight the relationship between both forms and the function of the female body during and after pregnancy. The choice to include both eggs and breasts and to hybridize the two thus allowed for the women to depict two distinct components of the female body, eggs and breasts, both of which are essential to procreation and by extension maternity. In so doing, and by having this installation in the space of the kitchen, Fraser, Hodgetts, and Welch call attention to the actual labor involved in biological maternity, and specifically, the labor involved in lactation. The discourse surrounding breastfeeding, both historically and in the present, suggests that the process is quote unquote natural. In efforts to entreat women to nurse their own infants, There is a considerable amount of rhetoric designed to make lactating mothers feel that they should instinctively be able to latch an infant moments after birth. This discourse belies the fact that nursing is a learned behavior for both mother and infant. Trust me when I say this, I have a 1-year-old. Trust me when I say this, that not all infants are able to latch well or feed effectively from the outset. And I can imagine that almost anyone here who has ever breastfed a child would probably agree with that fact. Moreover, portraying breastfeeding as quote unquote natural undercuts the tremendous amount of effort expended in breastfeeding to ensure that supply is maintained and that children are adequately nourished. Not to mention, in more recent years, the mechanization of breastfeeding through breast pumps, which were in limited use in the 1970s, makes the process feel as far from natural as possible. By focusing on the structures of the female body used to feed children in a space where the labor of food preparation occurs, Hodgetts, Fraser, and Welf ruminate on the actual work of lactation. As such, the nurturing kitchen functions to highlight the ways in which maternal labors, like other kitchen labor, are rendered invisible in an effort to revalue gendered work. Heaven or Hell is another work that considers feeding as a form of feminized work. The Feminist Art Workers, as a collective, was founded through the educational and artistic programs of the Los Angeles Women's Building. According to founding member Sherry Galkey, quote, "Our goal was, what we did as performance artists, was we brought together feminist education techniques with performance art. So we created interactive, participatory performance structures. From the outset, feminist art workers wanted their audiences to take on an active role and to participate in the experience in the hope that in so doing, they would feel engaged and a part of a feminist community. Heaven or Hell is one such participatory work that they performed in multiple venues over the years. The work derives from a story told by member Nancy Angelo's grandmother about the difference between heaven and hell. According to Angelo, quote, "People in hell sat at long banquet tables that were piled high with sumptuous food. They were all trying to feed themselves with 4-foot-long forks, and they were jabbing themselves in the mouth, and no one could get their food in. Heaven was the exact same scene with the beautiful food and all the people with the 4-foot-long forks, but they were feeding each other." From this story, the feminist art workers constructed 4-foot-long forks of their own and used them to attempt to feed themselves and their counterparts, and in some performances invited the audience to do the same. The gesture of feeding was considered an explicit extension of womanhood to the feminist art workers. As they wrote in a description of the project from 1981, feminist art workers intends to value the traditionally female values of nurturance while freeing women from nurturing others at the expense of themselves. For the collective, the act of feeding was intrinsically linked to the discourse of femininity, and particularly to the care work associated with women's roles in the family. Recognizing the ways that the labor of motherhood has been delineated so as the needs of both the husband and children are considered more important than those of the women caring for them, feminist art workers sought to create a work that would undermine the conventional understanding of feeding as an action. In their performance, they provided women with the opportunity to be cared for and to recognize women for the droves of invisible labor they perform on a daily basis. Yet while the piece serves to criticize and challenge the patrilineal delineation and valuation of work within the family, the act of feeding in Heaven or Hell also demonstrates the positive power of such a gesture as a form of feminine labor. The 4-foot-long forks became a symbol of feminist empowerment, a tool to be used to help women in their fight against patriarchal oppression. When they created a postcard version of the work in 1981, they referred to the forks as a symbolic weapon. They wrote, quote, "Feminist artists, political workers, arm yourself with 4-foot-long forks, create opportunities to feed one another in a symbolic gesture. As you go out and affect the world, take with you our support, appreciation, and encouragement to keep nurturing and inspiring one another. For it is our ability to sustain each other that will enable our political movements to endure." End quote. The idea of nurturing and caring for others as an embodied act, or as embodied in the act of feeding, was thus considered a positive attribute, one that instead of hindering women's progress was considered essential to it. As we can see from these examples, issues of food-based labor were prominent in several different feminist artworks during the 1970s, and many women artists used their practice to call attention to the various forms of invisible labor performed by women in an effort to advocate for gender equality. Having considered this broader history, then returning to the test plate, we can see more fully the considerations of labor offered by Chicago are part of a broader artistic and political movement, one that sought to challenge the notion that one type of labor was valued more highly than another. This is true for the labor involved in setting the tables of the dinner party, as well as for the craft practices that were used in the creation thereof. The test place itself is a marker of the considerable amount of work enacted by Chicago and her various assistants in creating the final polished product of the dinner party. Moreover, in examining it, we get a better glimpse into a particular component of this monumental and sensorially overwhelming work, allowing us a new way to approach a well-known and historic piece. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. That was wonderful.
I'm gonna opt out of I'm gonna stop screen sharing.
And while you do that, I just want to say too, we have a few minutes left on the call, and we of course want to hear if people have questions regarding the topic for our scholar. You can drop them in the chat, or you can also again virtually raise your hand. So if you want to click on the participant button on the right-hand side, that will be an option down at the bottom of your screen where you can do that as well. We'd love to hear from some of you. While we wait for that too, Emily, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about if you felt comfortable talking a little bit about your upcoming book. Since I know that you mentioned that this isn't actually part of it, but it's so related with the themes, especially at the end where you were talking.
Yes. So my book that I'm currently working on, which is not scheduled to be out for years at this point, the manuscript's not even due for another year, but the book will focus on food and feminist art in Southern California. And so I've divided the book into two sections, thinking about each chapter is premised on what I call a dynamic relation. So it's some activity that we do with food. So it's eating or cooking or serving, and it's divided into two sections. One on labor, which is really what we were talking about today. And the second half is actually on consumption, because the two ways that I have found that women's relationships to food are most ideologically constructed and fraught are around the issues of labor, in which most of the labor that women do surrounding food is rendered invisible and valueless. But also when it comes to consumption, women are the ones who provide consumption for other people, or provide sustenance for other people. Women also have some of the most fraught relationships with the process of consuming food. Eating for most women is a fraught activity, and that's actually what I've been currently working on. And then finally, women are the ones whose bodies are actually encoded in the language of consumption. So it's not uncommon for women's body parts to be discussed as if they are foodstuffs. Euphemisms for breasts and for genitals are often linked to kind of food metaphors. And we also talk about the devouring gaze as a scopophilic tendency. So that's also part of there. So the last chapter is actually called Being Eaten, and it's thinking about women's bodies as consumable entities. So each chapter focuses on one work, one artist's engagement, very close readings like I did with the dinner party today, but tying it to a broader history of a certain food practice, as well as a specific kind of rooting within second wave feminism.
Thank you. So we have a couple great questions and comments, and I wanted to start just with Maxine, who said that when the dinner party was completed, there were dinners by and for women all over the country, and that they actually attended one in Minneapolis, which is fantastic. Could you speak at all to that moment? Where there was multiple dinners, or I wasn't aware that had happened.
Me or Maxine? Because I'm curious about Maxine's experience.
Either, yeah.
I'll talk. So the one I went to was a potluck, so we all brought our own dishes. And we were supposed to dedicate our evening to a woman who had influenced us. And being the good art historian that I was, I dedicated the evening to Linda Nochlin. So it was way back, and it was the winter of 78, 79, because I know I was pregnant. So it was happening all over the country. And it was about food and women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had heard that from Fred Lonadier had showed me photographs that he had taken at I guess they were eating cake outside of the San Francisco installation. And so I had known that had happened, but I know that potlucks were just integral to actually the creation of the dinner party, which I find a really amazing thing. So it's not just that there was one dinner party. In fact, there were hundreds, maybe even thousands of dinner parties that were part of this actual work, which I think is so amazing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really amazing.
It's really great.
We have a question from Gloria about the piece in PAFA's collection, and so asking if the original pieces of the dinner party are divided up. I can at least say that the piece from PAFA's collection is a test plate, so it's not one of the originals. maybe you could speak to where it is permanently installed.
Yeah, so the dinner party in its entirety, the full finished product is in the Sackler Center at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. So when it first opened, it traveled around the country. So I know it exhibited, started in San Francisco, that was where the initial installation was, and then it traveled to Houston, to Boston, Minneapolis, various other places throughout the country, and traveled for about, I think, 2 years. And the goal was for Chicago to find a home for it immediately, a permanent home for it immediately. And that actually didn't happen. It ended up sitting in storage for many years, and eventually was acquired by the Brooklyn Museum, and they have built a permanent installation for it. It has traveled subsequently, so it's gone to, I think it's gone to Los Angeles and a few other places. And it was in Los Angeles before it made its final trip home to the Brooklyn Museum. But it is on view now, well, not now, but barring COVID, accepting COVID, it is on view at the Brooklyn Museum. And they also have done, they did a few years ago, a major retrospective of Judy Chicago's work around the dinner party as well. So it is there. You can see the entryway banners that way. The test plates have made their way into lots of different collections. So this is a preparatory sketch. It's not the final work. And you can see actually there's a difference, right? There's the gold rim on the test plate that doesn't exist on the final plate. So it was really a working through the process, but the entire work is actually all together in the Brooklyn Museum.
We have so many nice questions in the chat. It's going to be hard to pick with the time that we have left. But so someone, I mean, we've had a few, let me see here. And feel free if there's ones you want to privilege over others, but.
Yeah, I was actually, sorry, the one on the breasts and the eggs and the breastfeeding in the nurturant kitchen, if I can. So that's actually something that will be in the book, and then I am planning on discussing, and I'm currently actually re-researching some of that. So I had, in the dissertation, I had talked about the various discourses around breastfeeding as to who should be feeding your children. And that's one of the ways that I had initially argued that breastfeeding is not a natural process, but a cultural construct, because there are always going to be politics around who is actually doing the feeding, and definitely thinking about race is a really important part of that, because particularly for American women, specifically during periods of enslavement, white American women didn't nurse their own children, Black women did. And so that's a very, very important part of that history that really shows us that this is a cultural construct about who is doing that actual feeding. But also, now that I have breastfed myself, I have a total revaluation of that labor that is definitely going to change that entire thing. So I already know that the dedication of this book will be to my daughter Penelope, who has changed my view on literally everything, but most importantly, maternity. So I definitely plan to talk about that in the book itself. Sorry, that was my selected question. Other questions that you found interesting, Abby?
Oh, well, I mean, that one definitely. And I think that that connects to one of the questions we got from Julia before that was talking about how critical race theory lens, how the critical race theory lens informs your work. And I know just from our meeting that even talking about Judy Chicago and how you framed this conversation, but I didn't know if there were other, like the breastfeeding example.
Yeah, so other examples, and I'm currently working on this revision in my chapter on eating. So the discussion that I have on eating is about the idea of a thin ideal, because the work that I'm looking at is a piece by Martha Rustler about anorexia, at the moment in which anorexia is actually starting to become something that people were talking about, was starting to be medicalized. And it's also a moment of food politics where for white Americans, the politics switch from paucity, because in the first half of the 20th century, you have the Great Depression and World War II, where food shortages were very common for most white Americans. In the post-war period and the period leading up to the 1960s and 70s, most middle class and upper class white folks had more than enough access to food, and the rhetoric around food consumption was not about getting enough food for nutrition, but actually moderating your food and what kinds of foods were good, and really kind of valuing thinness. But that's a really, really racialized construct. Thinness as the ideal woman's body type is that for white women, it is not universally true. There's evaluation of curves that exists in different cultures, especially as actually an explicit rejection of the dominance of white culture and the white body type. So in many Black feminist circles, for example, in addition to embracing natural hair as a way to kind of reject the dominance of white supremacy in terms of what aesthetics of the body should look like, there's also a rejection of I need to appear rail thin with no curve, with no, no roundness to the body whatsoever. And so that's another area in which critical race theory very explicitly informs the kind of analysis of the work that I'm doing. That's just one example. It comes up throughout, as you can see. So
we have a great kind of comment question from Bradley, who complimented your presentation, but also wanted to ask if the topic on food, feminism, and labor is in any way informed or confronts direct spatial constructions of women in spaces like the kitchen. So thinking about Gershwin Frederick's The New Housekeeping or the Frankfurt Kitchen in the early 1900s.
Yes, so the idea of thinking about food and feminism, and ironically, I am in my own kitchen right now. Yeah, so kitchens are, if you go back to histories of industrial design, the heights of kitchens were actually designed for women of a certain type. So notably, Julia Child, who filmed in a home-like kitchen, had to have her countertops raised because she was over 6 feet, because these spaces are industrially designed for women. And in fact, there are, the idea of maximizing efficiency for the housewife is central to that design. And that idea of maximizing the efficiency for the housewife is part of the Cold War politics and the new domesticity that second wave feminists were actually advocating against. Because one of the things that you see in the 1950s that leads to the feminism of the 1960s is a push for women to leave the public life that they had actually taken, particularly for middle-class white women, the public life that they had taken during World War II. And the way to entreat that is to say, well, your place is within this biological home, and that's where you see the rise of the quote-unquote nuclear family, right? People didn't live in individual pods of 3 or 4 people. They lived in large collective families where the labor was spread out. And that all gets centralized on the nuclear family in the post-war period when you moved your suburban house away from your relatives. And so all of that industrial design then informs what Betty Friedan will eventually call the problem that has no name, the critiques of the feminine mystique and the critiques of housewifery that thus inform a lot of the feminist challenges to labor by people like Chicago, by people like Martha Rustler, etc.
We have a couple more just before we end today. We're going to be wrapping it up, but we've got a recommendation from Lori about an artist for you to check out that might be helpful in your research. And then we had somebody who asked about if you wanted to speak on Judy Chicago's most recent work, and I don't know if that's something that you've on aging in the environment.
I admittedly have not looked at that very much because, so one of the things that I try to do as a historian is give myself very clear temporal limitations so that my projects actually, for a number of reasons, I actually try to stop this examination of second wave feminism in 1980 at the latest, because as we probably know, the backlash to second wave feminism started a little bit before that, but by the early 1980s with the rise of Reaganism, the backlash to second wave feminism was in full swing. And so the efforts and the goals of this moment were kind of on the decline. So because all of the women that I'm looking at, particularly Martha Rustler, Judy Chicago, look at Carolee Schneemann as well, and Eleanor Anton, were really prolific throughout this period and afterwards. To continue to look at their works afterwards is just kind of an overwhelming thing, and also in my mind would kind of taint it. But it doesn't mean that I shouldn't look at Chicago's later works, especially as an educator. It's definitely something that I should look into. But I have not. I know in her later projects, she got more into thinking about Jewish identity. I know she did a series of projects on the Holocaust. She also did stuff on birth, but I have not looked into much of that.
There's an immense amount of work to go through. Yeah. I feel that we have just some other wonderful comments for you. And, Maxine, it's a great point about so many of the women you mentioned being Jewish.
Yes. Yeah, and that actually informs a lot of their politics. So both Judy Chicago and Martha Rustler, their Jewish identity informs their engagement with politics. Both of them were kind of grew up in more liberal Jewish families that were involved in earlier social movements. Rustler in particular calls herself a red diaper baby, and refers to herself as kind of been engaged with Marxism because her father was a Jewish lawyer. So I think that part of their identities is definitely part of it. And they're not the only prominent Jewish women involved in second wave feminism, right? Most notably, Betty Friedan was also a Jewish woman, which finds the paradox of calling a concentration camp, a housewifery a concentration camp, to me is just baffling, especially, not even 30 years after the Holocaust, but that's what she did. So, yeah. So it is definitely part of, and I can say that having grown up in a Northeastern Jewish liberal family. My grandparents were involved in those kind of New York Jewish settlement house communities and labor union activisms, and with a father who was part of the SDS, that I think there is something about our culture that does lend itself towards social activism, and that really encourages that kind of push and that kind of critical thinking. So I definitely think it is a significant thing. And I know that Lisa Bloom has written about that specifically.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think that's a great place to sort of end our program. And I wanted to thank you, Emily, for being here and sharing your scholarship, and thank everyone else for joining us for another event. I'm dropping a link really quick for just future events, and just a quick plug, and I'll let Emily say goodbye in a second. But I think about like artists and legacy reminds me, tomorrow for our PAFA pours, we have an event that's actually called Artist Papers. So we have our archivist and one of our curators, and two archivists who are also working on a project are going to be talking about how we create artist stories. And so what are the ways that we build archives that help build the research for people like Emily to tell these stories on individuals. So if you're around tomorrow, that's at 5:30, and the link is dropped in the chat.
Thank you all so much for coming and for listening to me talk about Judy Chicago, which I could do for 10 days if I really had time. So
thank you again, and everyone be safe, and we hope to see you all again soon. So take care.
Thank you.
Oh, bye, Sarah.
Thank you.
That was so interesting.